Welcome, students, professionals, and intellectually curious minds. I am so thrilled to have you here today. Let's just dive right in, okay? We're exploring Chapter 1, Why Economics Needed a Rethink. This is a master-level explainer of how the entire field of economics fundamentally shifted away from a world of elegant, yet entirely flawed, mathematical perfection, and basically crashed headfirst into psychological reality. We're going to trace the fascinating collapse of the purely rational agent model and see exactly how behavioral economics rose up to take its place. Today's syllabus traces this whole paradigm shift. We're covering 1. The classical utility illusion, 2. The Allais paradox, 3. Simon's bounded rationality, 4. Prospect theory's new mathematics, and finally, 5. The dual process mind. Section 1. The classical utility illusion. You know, for a very long time, the smartest people in the room genuinely believed they could reduce human choice to precise, frictionless calculations. To really understand the behavioral revolution, we first have to understand what it was revolting against, right? Back in the 18th century, Jeremy Bentham had this radical ambition to literally measure pleasure and pain through his philosophic calculus. He basically wanted to do for ethics what Newton did for physics. Then came the marginalist revolution in the 1870s, arguing that prices are determined by the marginal utility, the satisfaction you get from the very last unit you consume. But it was Paul Samuelson in 1938 who really stripped the psychology completely out of the field. With his concept of revealed preference, he argued that, hey, we don't need to look inside someone's head. If a person chooses bundle A over bundle B, they prefer it, and therefore it improves their welfare. By definition, boom, end of story. Then, in 1944, John von Neumann, who was arguably the most versatile mathematical mind of the 20th century, along with Oscar Morgenstern, gave this movement its mathematical crown. They called it expected utility theory. They proved mathematically that if a person's choices follow 4 seemingly unbreakable axioms of rational choice, completeness, transitivity, continuity, and independence, then that person is behaving exactly as if they are maximizing expected utility. This incredible equation became the absolute gold standard for how a rational agent should navigate risk. Now, the really crucial point here is the independence axiom. In the abstract, it sounds like basic common sense. It logically insists that a shared, common component shouldn't change your fundamental preference between 2 options. Think of it like this. If you prefer apples to oranges, finding out that you also have a banana shouldn't suddenly make you prefer oranges, right? Shared elements should be completely irrelevant. Section 2. The Allais paradox. Fast forward to 1952. At a risk conference in Paris, a prickly, combative French economist named Maurice Allais stepped up to the podium, and he exposed a fatal, undeniable flaw in this perfect mathematical armor. Let's test this out together. I really want you to play along mentally here. Imagine having to choose between option A, a guaranteed £1 million, and option B, which gives you an 89% chance at 1 million, a 10% chance at 5 million, but a 1% chance at absolutely nothing. Got your answer? Most people immediately pick A. Now, a second scenario. Option C is an 11% chance at 1 million, while option D is a 10% chance at 5 million. What do you choose now? Interestingly, most people pick D. So here is the truly explosive part. Choosing A and then D completely violates the independence axiom. Literally, if you do the algebra, that combination cannot be rationalized by any utility function. What Allais proved is that we don't just act like robots calculating expected utility. We have a profound, deeply rooted psychological preference for certainty, the certainty effect. When you drop a probability from 100% to 99%, it feels massively different than dropping it from 11% to 10%, even though the mathematical reduction is exactly the same. The cognitive dissonance of this paradox was so undeniable that Leonard Savage, who was one of the primary architects of subjective expected utility theory and who was sitting right there in the audience, took the test and he chose A and D. He mathematically violated his own rules. When someone pointed this out to him, he essentially hand-waved it away, claiming he just hadn't had his morning coffee and made a careless calculation error. But Allais knew better. It wasn't a careless error. It was a perfect demonstration of how the human brain actually values certainty. Section 3. Simon's bounded rationality. With the classical fortress thoroughly cracked, Herbert Simon came along and offered a completely new framework for understanding the realistic mechanisms of human decisions.
Simon observed that the standard model required humans to have complete information, perfectly reliable probability distributions, and the capacity to run massive optimization equations in our heads. Well, that is computationally impossible for a biological system. Instead, Simon argued that we do something called satisficing. It's a brilliant portmanteau of the words satisfying and sufficing. We basically set an aspiration threshold, and the very moment we find an option that meets it, we stop searching. We find what's good enough.
This was a massive paradigm shift. Simon insisted that satisficing is not some irrational error or a lazy mistake. It is highly rational behavior correctly described. Failing to endlessly optimize isn't a cognitive bug. It's a brilliant, highly adaptive response to a messy world where our time, bandwidth, and information are severely limited. We just make the best choice we can with the finite resources we have.
Section 4. Prospect Theory's New Mathematics. Building directly on Simon's foundation of bounded rationality, psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky arrived on the scene in the 1970s. And they didn't just point out flaws, they supplied the specific mechanisms for how we actually make choices.
When you map this out visually, it's a massive shift in how we understand human value. We move away from the pure robotic math of the straight expected value line. Then we go to the concave curve of neoclassical utility, which at least finally accounted for risk aversion. And finally, we arrive at Kahneman and Tversky's revolutionary S-curve of prospect theory. Notice how it originates from a central reference point in the middle, and look at how aggressively it dips down into the loss domain. This S-curve is built on 3 pillars that reflect stark reality. First, reference dependence. We don't evaluate our wealth in absolute terms. We judge it based on where we started. Second, loss aversion. The curve is much steeper for losses because losing 100 pounds physically and psychologically feels significantly worse than gaining 100 pounds feels good. And third, probability weighting. We systematically overweight tiny probabilities, which, by the way, perfectly explains why the exact same person will buy a lottery ticket and take out an insurance policy.
What Kahneman and Tversky effectively did was officially separate description from prescription. Expected utility is what we call a normative model. It's a really good mathematical map of what perfectly rational agents should do. But prospect theory is a descriptive model. It explains what flesh and blood people actually do. It answered the Allais paradox by proving that human valuation just isn't a straight, rational line. It's a deeply asymmetric, messy psychological reality. Section 5. The Dual Process Mind. Now, this whole journey leads us to a truly fascinating question. If we have these brilliant normative models, why do even highly trained economists, people like Leonard Savage who understand the math perfectly, still fall into these predictable cognitive traps? The answer lies deeply embedded in our cognitive architecture. Daniel Kahneman's dual process framework elegantly deconstructs the mind, showing how 2 qualitatively different modes of processing govern our everyday judgments. It is a constant and honestly highly unequal interplay between 2 distinct systems in our brains. First, we have System 1. This operates instantly. It's fast, automatic, entirely unconscious, and it handles our intuitive answers, like instinctively knowing 2 + 2 = 4. Then we have System 2. This is our slow, deliberate, conscious reasoning. It's supposed to do the heavy lifting, right? Calculate the probabilities, check the math. But here's the catch. System 2 is inherently lazy, and it only monitors System 1 selectively. So, the real reason even experts fail is because cognitive traps and heuristics are generated instantaneously by System 1. And because these rapid associations intuitively feel so incredibly right, they don't trigger any red flags. Our deliberate System 2 just assumes everything is fine and simply rubber stamps the error without ever bothering to check the math. That brings us to one of the absolutely most vital takeaways from all this material. Bias isn't about being uneducated, and it certainly isn't about lacking intelligence. These errors are fundamentally physically hardwired into how our brains process information and assess risk. We are biological creatures relying on mental shortcuts just to survive a vastly complex world. Now, traditionalists have definitely pushed back over the years, arguing these biases are just laboratory parlor tricks that disappear in real, highly stakes markets. But behavioral economics has thoroughly answered those defenses. The data unequivocally proves that core behavioral findings persist heavily in real-world field data. Better psychology actually generates better economic predictions. And most importantly, realizing that human cognition relies on heuristics demands that we actively design our financial institutions, our apps, and our policies to accommodate actual human beings, not mythical, perfectly calculating robots. Which leaves us with a profound question to end on. As you look at all the evidence we've explored today, if our minds are bounded, if our heuristics are automatic, and if our choices are heavily shaped by external choice architecture and defaults, is perfect rationality an illusion we can simply no longer afford to believe in? And if so, how much of your financial life is truly, purely autonomous? Think about that the next time you make a major financial decision. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking the big questions, and I'll see you next time.